the wheel, the light bulb, the automobile, the refrigerator, personal computers, the internet, and the smartphone. What do all of these life-changing inventions have in common? Each is the product of innovation, a trait that has been the cornerstone of how our country has grown and blossomed into the world leader it is today. This same trait will be the cornerstone for years to come. Today, innovation is all around us, in agriculture, energy, transportation, and technology, especially here in Boston in the medical and life sciences industries. In late 2020, Jack Shields, BC High Class of 1979, funded the Shields Center for Innovation with a $5 million gift. Jack's vision was to build on the area's history of innovation, cultivating that spirit while teaching students the skills they need to be innovators of the future. All of which brings us here today, the inaugural event of the Shields Center for Innovation. Hello and welcome. My name is Cotter Regan, and on behalf of BC High, thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to kick off this season's programming for the Shields Center of Innovation. Launched in 2020, thanks to the generous support of Jack Shields, a member of the BC High Class of 1979 and proud parent of a member of the Class of 2006, the center focuses on driving a culture of innovation for our students to drive change in Boston and beyond. Earlier this year, we hosted programs that discussed why innovation matters and how innovation can be taught. Our guests have included visionaries from Boston's innovation economy, as well as educational leaders from Babson, Boston College, Harvard, and Northeastern. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by someone who has been a leader in innovation throughout her career, former Hewlett-Packard CEO, Carly Fiorina. Carly Fiorina was the first woman to lead a Fortune 50 company. Under Carly's leadership, revenue grew, innovation tripled, growth quadrupled, and HP became the 11th largest company in the U.S. Carly is also no stranger to the value of Catholic education. In February 2019, Carly and the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America began an academic partnership. Carly was appointed the Distinguished Clinical Professor in Leadership, and together they are integrating Carly's leadership and problem-solving curriculum into the business student experience. She brings with her real-world experience on how to drive a culture of innovation, and I'm delighted to be speaking with her today. Welcome, Carly.
Thank you so much, Grace. It's great to be with you and with all the students. Thanks for having me.
We're delighted. So, Carly, to kick off today, let's talk about what does innovation mean to you?
Innovation fundamentally is thinking about something differently. It's about doing something new. It's about perhaps approaching an old problem in a new way. But fundamentally, it's about challenging the status quo, not accepting what is, and deciding to do something new and different instead. Innovation is fundamental. It might be as fundamental as the light bulb or the PC, or it might be something a little bit more everyday, like challenging the status quo where you live and work. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, innovation is absolutely required for progress of any kind. And the reason innovation is difficult is because the status quo is powerful, even when we know it's not all it could be, and change is hard, even when we think we want it.
I love that. And you know, before we started, we were talking a little bit about the pandemic, and I'd love to hear how you think of innovation with this new world that we live in.
So, you know, one of the things that happens is when there's a crisis, innovation frequently happens more easily because it's an absolute requirement. And the pandemic, of course, was a crisis in so many ways. And so there were innovations such as in the development of vaccines, but there were also innovations in communication, and we're experiencing one right now. I think the best teams, the best organizations, whether those are academic institutions or business enterprises of some kind, I think the best, highest performing teams and organizations innovated during the pandemic and now are prepared to retain those innovations, to really think carefully about what did we learn, how did we get better at innovation, and to hang on to that. But I think there's no question that we're not going to go back to the way things were prior to the pandemic. Some things, for example, how we communicate, I think are forever changed. And other things like telemedicine, for example, are accelerated by what we learned and had to do during the pandemic.
Right. And, I think about seizing the crisis. I'd love to hear your experience of how you've seized crises and how you've made, those great moments out of a crisis.
So let me first say that one of the reasons that innovation is difficult, I mentioned that you are challenging the status quo when you innovate. That's always true. But the other reason that innovation is so difficult is because if you're doing something new, if you're trying something new, it means that you are taking risks. You are taking risks, and in many cases, taking those risks will be criticized. That's just reality. It's also true that when you take risks of any kind, you're going to make some mistakes. And so one of the things that I say to organizations, for example, that tell me I want more innovation, is I say, okay, if you want more innovation, then you need to encourage risk-taking. And if you're going to encourage risk-taking, then you need to be prepared to tolerate mistake-making. And so one of the things that makes innovation difficult is teams, individuals have to get comfortable with the fact that I'm going to make mistakes when I take risks. The key is not to make the same mistake over and over again. The key is to identify the mistake, learn from the mistake, and move on. But we need to get real. If we're going to innovate, we got to take risk. And if we're going to take risk, we're going to get criticized, and we're also going to make some mistakes along the way.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest barriers to innovation might be?
Yeah. So, when I arrived at Hewlett Packard, just by way of illustration, when I arrived at Hewlett Packard, we were one of the very few corporations left in America that had a large centralized research budget. So there was HP Labs, and at the time there was still Bell Labs. We spent about $200 million a year on research and innovation. And yet, we were not among the top 25 innovators in the world. In other words, we were spending the money, we were hiring the people, we had all the labs, and yet we were not innovating. And in fact, the vast majority, 98+% of our revenues came from products that had been in existence for quite a while. By every objective measure, we were not innovating. Even though we were spending money on it, we had a history and a heritage of it, and people said it was important to them. I start with that just as illustration that innovation isn't all that easy. So what did we do? I asked some really basic questions. I asked, for example, what do we measure? What do we measure? Are we keeping track of innovation? And it turns out we weren't measuring anything relevant to innovation. We weren't measuring the percentage of revenues that came from new products. We weren't measuring how many patents we produced. And critically as well, the culture did not tolerate mistakes. And so people were very focused on getting it right every time. So we did a couple really fundamental things. We started measuring risk taking. We started measuring how many patents are we producing, for example, how many new products are we producing. We started lifting up people who took risks and, yes, made mistakes in the organization and saying, see, this is what innovation looks like. And we began to celebrate learning through mistakes. Hey, we made this mistake, but here's what we learned. And those pretty fundamental things, and of course we kept spending money, but those pretty fundamental things changed our trajectory fundamentally. And so we went from not knowing how many patents we produced to 3 a day, to 7 a day, to 9 a day, and ultimately we were producing almost 14 patents a day. I say all that by way of illustration that innovation is something everybody says they want, but you have to get real clear about the fundamentals of innovation. Seeing something a new way, doing something different, challenging the status quo, taking a risk, making a mistake, and you need to be willing to track all those things to make sure you're actually doing them.
Wow. Yeah, and the data pieces are so important. I agree with you there. I think that's amazing. It's said that you can't have innovation without failure. And how have you learned from your failures or your challenges in your career? I think that'd be really important for our boys, our students to hear.
Yeah. You know, sometimes I think the word failure is so fraught that it causes people to be afraid to take risk. And as I have been saying, risk taking is fundamental to progress and innovation and growth and learning and adaptation. Here's what I consider a failure. A failure is when someone keeps making the same mistake over and over and over again. A failure is when someone walks away from an opportunity that's right in front of them. A failure is when someone has a pressing problem that really is theirs to solve, and they turn away and say, nah, I'm not going to do anything about that. And so while I've made a lot of mistakes, I hope I've not failed. And that's not a semantic difference to me. So the first thing that I would say to the young men at Boston College High School is don't believe that failure, so to speak, is final or fatal. It's not final or fatal unless you let it be. Be prepared to make mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, I guarantee you're not using all of your potential. You're not challenging yourself. You're not taking any risks. You're not getting any better, and you're not learning as much as you could. Make mistakes, but learn from them. And don't make the same mistake twice. And when others, perhaps, tell you you're a failure, make sure you understand what happened, why did it happen, and then pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and move on.
That's great. You know, our boys, we talk a lot about resilience at BC High, and actually Jack Shields talks about iterating, and I love using that word with the boys to say, you know, it's good to iterate and to redo and find new ways to be successful, and the boys, I think they respond to that.
And by the way, Grace, I might just add, one of the inventors of the inventions that you talked about early on, I might get this wrong, but I think it was the light bulb, but said there's no such thing as a failure. There's only learning what not to do again. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. So when you think about innovation, do you think it's just for the private sector, or can every organization be innovative?
It's absolutely not just for the private sector. And in fact, every organization to every team, actually every individual, to achieve their potential and to perform at the highest level, mm-hmm. must innovate. Because if we back up and think about innovation's a big fancy word, but what does it really mean? Trying something new, doing something differently, approaching a familiar problem in a new and different way. And so without innovation, everyone, no matter where they are, no matter who they are, everyone gets stuck in the status quo. It's amazing to me how we're prepared to tolerate the status quo, even when we know it's really unacceptable. I started my business career as a secretary, way at the bottom of the corporate ladder. And everywhere I went, I saw problems. And this is true of every organization. I do a lot of work with nonprofits, with government agencies, with for-profits, and with small teams. And what is common in all those experiences is everyone knows what the problems are. I mean, we talk about them, we complain about them, we gossip about them. We know what the problems are, whether they're small or whether they're really, really big. But we tolerate them. And we tolerate these problems because the status quo is powerful. And when people step out and say, why don't we think about it differently? Why are we still doing it this way? Why not? Guess what? There's a lot of criticism and there's a lot of signaling to people, just stay in your own lane and keep your head down. And who do you think you are? Innovation is vital for progress of any kind. And it's also vital for someone to achieve their potential and perform at their highest level.
Yeah. Carly, I know HP dates all the way back to 1939, and so here in Boston we have many older institutions. Are there particular challenges driving innovation in the older institutions or the more seasoned institutions?
Yes, there absolutely are, because look, it is human nature. It is human nature to rest on our laurels, if I can say it that way. And so it's human nature when things are going well enough to say it's good enough. And so when you have a successful, powerful, long-standing institution, the instinct is to say we have to preserve what has made us successful. And we're pretty successful. And so let's not rock the boat too much. We don't want to lose the things that have made us great and made us who we are. By the way, there's a lot of truth to that. Successful, long-standing organizations have things that make them special and that have contributed to their success. But when that special sauce becomes an impediment to change or innovation of any kind, then you have a problem. That happened to HP. It had stopped growing. It had stopped innovating because every time somebody tried to do something new, people would say, no, that's not the HP way. And that happens a lot. It's not because people are bad. It's because people are hanging on to what they know has worked in the past. And it's also because, again, trying something new is taking a risk. Well, what if it doesn't work? And so I've come to believe that the secret to innovation, particularly in a successful, long-standing organization, is to preserve the best and reinvent the rest. So preserve the things that are truly unique to a long-standing and successful organization. Preserve them, but reinvent everything else. Because without that reinvention, that constant innovation and challenging the way things are so that we can think through some new ways to make it better, people just settle into a comfortable status quo. One last thing on this point, if I can say, Grace, Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, a great innovator and scientist in his own right, he's often misquoted. People think that Charles Darwin said the strongest of the species survive. That's not what he said. What he said is, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but those most adaptive to change. And adaptation to change is actually what innovation is all about.
That is wonderful. What are some of the innovations that you're watching right now in our country or in the business world that you really are jazzed by?
Well, I think the biggest problems that face us will not be solved without innovation. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the biggest problems that face us? And the flip side of that is innovations that I'm jazzed by. Mm-hmm. Climate change and global warming. Mm-hmm. We know that we face real crises now. And I think the evidence is clear. And without real innovation, we will not be able to solve those problems. So I think all of the innovation that's going on in the area of climate change, global warming is incredibly important. I think we know another area that's very interesting and exciting to me. We know we face a healthcare crisis in this country still. We had one before the pandemic, we have one during the pandemic, we have one after the pandemic. And what I mean by a healthcare crisis is we don't have still adequate healthcare that's available and accessible to everyone. And yes, government policy is important in all these areas, but so is innovation. And unfortunately, given the makeup of government isn't terribly innovative. Big bureaucracies don't tend to be innovative at their core because big bureaucracies tend towards self-preservation. It's just the way the processes are set up. And so breakthrough innovations, generally speaking, come from the private sector. And I think that will happen in healthcare as well. It's why I mentioned telemedicine. Yeah. It's why biotech is so exciting. And then, of course, finally, and we saw this during the pandemic, there continue to be huge innovations in the area of communication. And it's also true that I think we're seeing more and more the downsides of some of the innovations in communication. There are real downsides to social media that we are becoming more and more familiar with. And it's important that we sometimes talk about the downsides of innovation as well as the upsides, because both exist.
Oh, I agree 100%. You know, when you think about your career and, starting out early on and as you've moved on, how did you learn to be innovative? Who do you read? What companies did you watch? Are there people that you looked at that said, that's the person I want to be when I grow up?
Well, let me say that, honestly, it started in a very inelegant, prosaic way. It started way at the beginning when I was at the very bottom. Look, I started at the very bottom of a huge corporation. I had majored in medieval history and philosophy. I know BC high school students appreciate that, but not everybody does. I had dropped out of law school. I'd run away to Italy to teach English. I'd finally gotten an MBA. I go through all that to give your students hope that you don't have to have a perfect resume. Mm-hmm. But with that rather checkered resume, let me say, I felt unqualified in many ways. And I entered the business world at a time when a lot of women were overlooked. Mm-hmm. So why do I start with that? I start with that because I came to work and didn't have big ambitions to move ahead. I thought that was beyond me. But what I did see were problems everywhere. And I saw people talking about those problems. And it frustrated me that nobody was doing anything about the problems. And so what I started doing was talking to people who knew something about the problem and working with them to solve the problem. In other words, I sort of learned the process of innovation on a very small scale. But that's what problem solving is, really. It's looking at an old problem in a new way so it can be solved. I started learning about innovation in a very small scale way because there were lots of problems in front of me. By the same token, I think I learned about risk taking because if you looked like me, where I started out, speaking up was taking a risk. Raising your hand and making demands that something could be better was taking a risk. And so I learned how to find the courage to express a new idea. And I learned also how to withstand that wall of silence you get when nobody thinks that new idea really is very smart. I say all that, Grace, to say that I think sometimes innovation is such a big, fancy word, and we think about light bulbs and PCs and don't think it applies to us. But I truly believe that learning how to be innovative, learning how to take risks, learning that mistakes aren't fatal, learning how to talk to people who have a different viewpoint than you do, which is frequently what challenges us to think about something different. Those are human things that all of us can learn, but all of us also have to practice. And while we may learn it at first on a small scale, over time, we get practiced enough that we can do it on a big scale.
Yeah. That's beautiful. So much of what we're doing at BC High is about unlocking potential, and I know that's dear to your heart. So maybe you could talk about unlocking potential in some of your writing and some of your curriculum.
Yeah. So one of the things that I learned early on in this problem-solving mode is that everybody has more potential than they realize. And that has been proven true over and over and over again. So in all my years of experience, I can say with absolute certainty, everybody has more potential than they realize. Every single person. What unlocks our potential is a challenge, a problem, a difficulty. Our potential doesn't get unlocked when everything is going well. That's one of the truths of life. Our potential doesn't get unlocked when everybody agrees with us. Our potential doesn't get unlocked when everybody says, wow, you're just great. Our potential gets unlocked when we're challenged. And frequently, we're challenged when we run into someone who's different than we are. When somebody says to us, I think you're wrong. I disagree. I think you're full of it. I just see things totally differently than you do. That's a challenge. And that gets our brain going. So if we want to unlock our potential, we have to put ourselves in circumstances where we are confronted by people different from us all the time. Our potential is unlocked when we're presented with a problem. I see people every day who never know what they're made of until they run into a problem, until they run into something that they don't exactly know what to do with, until they're asked to do something they don't know how to do right away. And so what I would say to people is, first of all, you got more than you realize. You got more than you realize, I guarantee you. And if you want to know what you're really made of, Don't take the easy route. Challenge yourself. If I may, Grace, I want to tell one little story that might illustrate what I mean by this. And I tell it in my book, Find Your Way, because it's so fundamental. This is about a woman, and I know our students that we're speaking to today are all men, but it's not a gender issue. This is a woman that I met in the slums of India. And the slums of India are very, very desperate places. Desperate places. And her family was in desperate poverty. And the status quo for her, the status quo, the way things are, the way things were for her is desperate poverty, day in and day out, grinding poverty, day in and day out. And people just endured. And in her culture, women didn't do anything about that. They just endured. Everybody endured. And one day this woman had an opportunity to take a small loan and start a business to solve this problem. And, her husband said, no, we don't do that. We endure. This is our culture. And her parents said no. Well, long story short, eventually she found the courage to see something differently, to try something new. She took the loan. She started to build a business. It wasn't all easy. It didn't all go smoothly. But I asked her when I met her, well, what's your family think now? Because by then she was a successful entrepreneur. And she said, oh, they're all very happy. They all work for me. The point is, she never knew what she was made of. None of us ever know what we're really made of or how much potential we really have until we confront a problem, until we confront something that maybe we've been willing to live with, until we are challenged by a new idea. Maybe you could take a loan and become an entrepreneur. So don't sit back, don't settle, challenge yourself.
I love that. And I love what you said about a little earlier about raising your hand as taking a risk. So we have a school of almost 1,400 boys, a little over 1,400 boys, and not everybody wants to raise their hand. It's a big school and you could get lost. What do you say to the kid in the back of the class hoping he doesn't get called on?
Well, I know how that feels. I know how that feels. Let me start by saying that I have been described by some people as fearless, and that's not true. I just have had a lot of practice getting over fear. I've been afraid so many times of so many things. I was that person in the back of the room hoping not to be called on. I was a shy, goody two-shoes, parent-pleasing middle child. So I understand what that feels like. But what I've learned is that courage is not the absence of fear, it's being able to get over fear. And getting over fear takes practice. So if you're sitting in the back of the room and you're afraid to raise your hand, think to yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen? What's the worst thing that can happen if you raise your hand and you say something? Well, let's go through the worst things that can happen. The worst things that can happen is some people in the class think you're an idiot. Okay. Maybe you make a mistake when you raise your hand. Maybe you don't get it exactly right when you raise your hand. Maybe people turn around and look at you funny. Okay. Those are some of the worst things that can happen. Now ask yourself, what's the best thing that can happen? Well, the best thing that can happen is you actually ask a question that's on everybody else's mind. The best thing that can happen is you make a point nobody else ever thought of. The best thing that can happen is you take one step in getting over that fear. I'll guarantee you this. If you don't practice getting over what you're afraid of, your fear will control you. If you practice getting over your fear, then you will develop courage. And here's the other thing I can promise you from personal experience. No matter what you do, no matter what you do in life, if you innovate, if you make a difference, if you solve a problem, if you come up with a new idea, no matter what you do, you will get criticized. That's especially true today on social media. No matter what you do, if you stick your head up in any way, if you raise your hand, if you come up with a better idea, even if it's a fantastic idea, someone's going to criticize you. So decide now. Criticism just comes with the territory. It's not going to kill you. It's not fatal. And for all those people who are criticizing you, I promise you, there are people maybe silently cheering you on, but they're cheering you on nevertheless.
I love that. That is so great. You know, when you think about this past year or the past 18 months, 24 months, and even in business or in your classroom, how do you keep yourself motivated? How do you keep yourself inspired? Who inspires you? And then, you know, how do you keep those around you inspired when things aren't going well?
Yeah. Well, it's such an important question because, boy, the last 18 months, by the way, I sort of lose track of time with COVID. It feels like sort of a whole year just disappeared. So I always have to mentally check, is it 2021? Has it been a year and a half, almost 2 years? And it has. But it's been such a difficult time. And it's in particular been such a difficult time for your students and students like them all over the country and all over the world. I mean, wow, what a really difficult time. And also very difficult for parents and teachers. So I think one of the things that has helped me and perhaps helps your students is to remember that none of us are alone in this. We are going through, all of us together, an amazing, terrible in many ways, but nevertheless a bonding common experience. And I think the worst thing about this pandemic is that people felt like they were alone because in many cases they were physically isolated. And it's why all these wonderful communications innovations have been so important. You know, in my business, just as an example, we were accustomed to doing everything face to face. And we had to learn, just like everybody else had to learn. We had to learn how to stay connected virtually. So we're not alone. None of us are alone in this. Secondly, all of us have learned adaptability. And actually, adaptability is an incredibly important skill in life. Without adaptability, there is no resilience. And Charles Darwin, it is those most adaptive to change. What we've learned in this process is to adapt. And we need to hang on to that because in my experience, adaptability and resilience is the single greatest predictor of success in life. It's not IQ. It's not where you were born or what you look like or what your style is, or honestly, even where you go to school, although getting a great education gives you a huge leg up. The biggest predictor of success, in my experience, is adaptability and resilience. And so people, I think, hopefully have learned some of those skills. And the final thing I would say, we're not alone, adaptability and resilience. The final thing is to keep in mind what's important. The best teams, the best organizations, the most resilient individuals keep in mind what's important to them. What's important? For my organization, it's serving our clients. What's important to each individual? What are my key priorities? And if you can hang on to those things and not let them get washed away in this very difficult 18 to 20 months we've lived through, then you'll be stronger and better and more able to innovate, honestly, coming out of this.
Thank you for that. You know, I think about BC High in the past 18 to 24 months, and I'm so grateful to our faculty, staff, administration, board. We all came together, and we really kept
Yes.
mission at heart, mission center, and the boys at our heart to make sure that they were successful and felt safe. And our faculty and staff did a phenomenal job. So I love that. I love that adaptability and resilience, because we talk about resilience all the time at BC High. That's a great lesson.
And Grace, to your point, the best teams came together even more effectively during this. And the goal, of course, is to hang on to that, to sort of be analytical about, okay, what did we do differently as a team that we need to keep doing? Because people had to perform at a higher level during this crisis. And the goal is to keep performing at that higher level.
Right. And you know, as a Jesuit Catholic school, our Ignatian values really guide everything, and reflection is really important for us, for our students, our faculty and staff. And we spent a lot of time reflecting on, you know, the consolation and desolation of this past 24 months. And you're right, there are so many good things that came out of it. There are so many new things, innovative parts of our curriculum, the technology. But, you know, we also, I agree with you about we're not alone, but people were alone. And the mental health crisis in our country, you know, we are very mindful of that with our boys and making sure that we provide the services that they need to feel loved and cared for and safe. And so I think that's generally where the whole country is right now, that people are really struggling with what's the new normal. So this is really helpful. I think the boys will really respond to your words. So thank you.
And you know, Grace, when you mention values, it's so important to stress that just for a moment, if I may, because honestly, one of the other values that I think we are reminded of in this pandemic is empathy. Mm-hmm. And empathy, you know, I coach leadership. Empathy is vital to real leaders. I mean, people without empathy do not lead. They do not lead. They may have big positions and titles, but they're not leading. You cannot lead without both humility and empathy, because humility teaches a leader I don't know it all, and empathy opens a leader up to learn new things, to accept new ideas, to be challenged by someone different than themselves. And so I do think when you have moments of consolation and desolation, it's an opportunity to gain humility and empathy and wisdom as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. Question for you. I'd love to hear more about the work you're doing at Catholic University and your curriculum there.
So one of the things that I have learned through experience is not only does every individual have more potential than they realize, but each of us has the capacity for leadership. Leadership is a term that we often associate with position or title. I did when I was in high school. I thought a leader was somebody with a big office, a big title. And so I thought, well, leadership isn't for me. And so what I focus on at Catholic University, what I focus on anytime I'm speaking with young people, so thank you so much for asking the question, is to say, each of you is capable of leading. A leader changes the order of things for the better. That's what leadership is. A leader changes the order of things for the better. A leader solves problems. A leader unlocks potential in others. And in order to do that, leaders must develop courage. They must have humility and empathy so that they can collaborate effectively with others. They must have character, and they must see possibilities in every set of circumstances. They have to see the possibilities for problem solving and innovation. And in particular, they have to see the possibilities that exist in themselves and in others. And so we're focused on the fundamentals of leadership. Yes, there are technical skills if you want to be a business leader. There are technical skills if you want to be in the medical field, et cetera. But the core of successful leadership are very human qualities that can be learned, that can be taught, and that are accessible to us all. Courage, character, humility, empathy, collaboration, and seeing possibilities in every set of circumstances.
That's incredible. One of the things we tell our students in the classroom is to make a difference in the classroom. And how can innovation drive more change in the community? How can our kids use that innovation into the community?
So, one of the things that I wanted to say very clearly in the latest book that I wrote, Find Your Way, was that the problem that's right in front of you is the problem you should solve. Just as I mentioned earlier on that, you start innovation on a small scale so that one day you're skilled enough to do it on a big scale. Well, the same is true of leadership and problem solving. So sometimes I think we, all of us, get hung up on, well, there's this huge problem that I have to do something about, global hunger or poverty. We talk about these big abstract problems, but the truth is there are problems right in front of us. There might be hunger right in front of us, or poverty right in front of us, or loneliness and desolation right in front of us. There are problems right in front of us, and those are our problems to solve. Those are our problems to solve. And the way we develop our leadership skills, the way we develop our innovation skills is by solving problems. Because the only way you solve an old problem is to look at it in a new way or to come up with a new idea. That's innovation. So I guess I would just say all the things that you're learning in school about innovation and problem solving, look around you. Look around you. There are a bunch of problems right around you. They don't have to be huge. They need to be near. They need to be near. And go to work on them and find people around you who are also willing to work on them and who aren't always going to agree with everything you say, but who will challenge the way you think sometimes and start solving them.
That's great. Carly, so many of our boys are thinking about what to do in their careers. Silicon Valley and tech have become synonymous with innovation. In Boston, so has biotech. What are some other industries that you'd suggest that are innovative? And that could apply to nonprofits, too.
Yes. Well, I think certainly the technology industry is very innovative in many, many, many ways. There are some ways, honestly, where it's not so innovative. So, for example, the technology industry is still one of the least diverse industries in the country. So they're not innovative in that way. And so it depends what kind of innovation you're thinking about. What I would say is this: look wherever you think your interests take you. Look first at the culture of an organization to determine whether it's innovative. Because innovation has a lot to do with the culture of a team or an organization. It's why a nonprofit can be very innovative in ways that may not be so obvious as biotech, but that are just as impactful in the community. So what's an innovative culture? Look around. Is there a team of people that challenge each other, that disagree with each other, that throw ideas around, that brainstorm creatively on a regular basis, or not? Is it a team that all looks the same? Normally speaking, by the way, most of us are comfortable with people just like ourselves. And so we tend to naturally surround ourselves with people like us. We're more comfortable. But when you're surrounded with people like yourselves, generally speaking, you're not going to be as innovative because our brains work differently when we are challenged by someone different who brings usually a different idea. So look around and see, what does a team look like? And then ask questions about risk taking and mistake making. And is this a buttoned up safe culture where people want it to be as perfect as possible, as opposed to a risk taking culture where people are willing to try new things?
That's great. Last question to kind of wrap us up here, but the Shield Center is unique in our effort to teach innovation at the secondary school level. What advice do you have for us as we move forward?
So one of the things that I think would be useful, and you may already be doing it, I think it's really important to connect the intellectual side of innovation with the, what I'll call, the human emotional side of innovation, because I think it's where a lot of people trip up. So we get in our heads all of the analytical, intellectual signposts of innovation. What do I mean by that? Patents, inventions, industries. All of those things are the intellectual, analytic signposts of innovation, and they're incredibly important. They're incredibly important. Equally important, in my experience, and it's why I told the Hewlett-Packard story. Equally important are those human qualities that encourage innovation. You can have lots of money and lots of emphasis on innovation and not be particularly innovative. And so unless people understand, innovation isn't just for a scientist in biotech. Innovation is something that is available, like leadership, to each of us as individuals. And here's what innovation takes: the courage to raise your hand, to take a risk, to make a mistake, to learn from it and move on, for example. Then we're not going to have as many innovators as we have the potential to have. And so I would just encourage you to continue to emphasize that.
Thank you. You know, we've really taken the approach of centers of human excellence here at BC High, and we see the intersectionality of all of those. So we have a global center, the Mike White Leadership Center for Emerging Leaders, the Shield Center for Innovation, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and our Ignatian Formation. And we're really trying to find the intersectionality of all of those with Heart Center, you know, with our mission at our center. So it's a very exciting time, and the Shield Center has certainly put us on the map as a school and really helped us to work with the boys to get them to think differently. And you know, we had a challenge last year, and I say some of the boys are wrecked for life because they're thinking so outside the box, and that's a good thing to get them to think. Yes. and to iterate, as we talk about. So.
Yes.
So Carly, this has been delightful. I really want to thank you for being with us and for sharing your story. I'd love to thank our students who are with us today, who have joined us and who continue to inspire me every day. They are why I do what I do. And I'd also like to thank Jack Shields for providing the opportunity to have events like this as part of the Shield Center as we prepare our boys for innovation outside Boston and beyond. So today, thank you, Carly. I hope you have a great day, and we hope to see you again soon.
Well, thank you, Grace, very much, and thanks to all of you who've participated, and a special thanks to Jack Shields as well. Thanks for having me.
Great.